In the rolling hills of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a weathered Amish farmer named Amos Hostetter had spent 15 years in almost complete silence. His wife's death had left him bitter and withdrawn, working his fields alone, speaking only, when necessary, at Sunday services. The community respected his grief, but worried about his growing isolation. When Bishop Kurtz arrived at his door with 7-year-old Grace, an orphan from a distant settlement, Amos's first instinct was to refuse. He was 58 years old, set in his ways, and convinced he had nothing left to offer a child. But something in Grace's quiet, watchful eyes reminded him of his late wife's gentle persistence. What happened next would transform not just 2 broken lives, but an entire Amish community's understanding of healing and hope. Could a grieving man and a lost child really save each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rooster's crow split the pre-dawn silence as it had for 15 years, but Amos Hostetter no longer heard it as a call to begin another day. It was simply noise, marking time until he could return to the blessed quiet of sleep. He rose from his narrow bed in the same methodical way he did everything, slowly, deliberately, without enthusiasm. The floorboards creaked under his feet as he padded to the kitchen, their familiar groans the only conversation he'd have until Sunday's worship service 3 days away. His farmhouse sat like a monument to stillness in the heart of Lancaster County's Amish country. 40 acres of rich Pennsylvania soil stretched in all directions, bordered by split-rail fences his grandfather had built with his own hands. The 2-story clapboard house, painted white as tradition demanded, showed signs of a man living alone: shutters slightly askew, a loose board on the porch steps, gutters that needed clearing. Not neglect, exactly, but the gradual settling that comes when there's no one to notice, no one to care about the small things that make a house a home. Amos moved through his morning routine with the precision of a man who had performed these same actions 5,475 times since Martha died. Coffee black, no sugar. 2 pieces of bread toasted over the wood stove. A quick scan of yesterday's edition of the Budget, the Amish newspaper that connected scattered communities across the country. He read the births and deaths, the weather reports from distant settlements, the small triumphs and tragedies of people he'd never meet. It was enough human connection for him. The kitchen still held traces of Martha's presence, though he trained himself not to see them. Her blue ceramic mixing bowls sat unused in the cupboard. Her apron hung on its peg by the door, faded now from years of sunlight streaming through the window. The small herb garden she'd tended outside the kitchen window had long since been overtaken by weeds. But sometimes, on humid summer mornings, he could still catch the ghost of her lavender and thyme on the breeze. Martha Hostetter had been 22 when she married him, a slight woman with quick hands and quicker wit, who could make him laugh until his sides ached. She'd filled this house with warmth, fresh bread cooling on windowsills, quilts draped over chairs, the sound of her humming while she worked. They'd had 30 years together, 30 years of shared silence over morning coffee, of her hand finding his during evening prayers, of plans for children who never came and dreams they'd learned to let go without bitterness. Cancer had taken her slowly, giving them time to say goodbye, but making the leaving no less brutal. Amos had watched her shrink away piece by piece, her bright spirit dimming as her body failed. In those final months, she'd made him promise to keep living, to find joy again, to remember that grief was love with nowhere to go. He'd promised because he couldn't refuse her anything, but in the 15 years since, he'd done little more than exist. His neighbors understood. The Amish knew grief, knew loss, knew that some wounds ran too deep for quick healing. They'd invited him to meals, included him in barn raisings, asked his advice on crops and weather. But gradually, as his silence stretched on, they'd learned to give him space. They still waved when they passed his farm, still asked after his health at church, but they no longer expected conversation. They'd accepted what Amos himself believed, that his capacity for human connection had been buried with Martha. Barn work took until mid-morning. Amos kept a small dairy operation, 6 Holstein cows, a handful of goats, enough chickens to supply eggs for himself and a few neighbors. The animals didn't require conversation, didn't expect smiles or warmth. They needed food, water, clean stalls, and regular milking. It was honest work that tired the body and quieted the mind, and for that he was grateful. He was mucking out the cow stalls when he heard the buggy wheels on gravel. Through the barn door, he could see Bishop Kurtz's distinctive gray mare picking her way up the lane. The bishop's visits were rare, usually reserved for matters of church discipline or community crisis. Amos set down his pitchfork and walked slowly toward the house, his mind running through possible reasons for this unexpected call. Bishop Kurtz was a man of 65, with a white beard that reached nearly to his chest and eyes that missed little. He'd led their district for 20 years with a steady hand and deep compassion, guiding families through birth and death, conflict and celebration. He climbed down from his buggy with the careful movements of age, then reached back to help a small figure emerge from behind the seat. Grace stepped into the morning sunlight like a cautious deer, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. She was small for 7, with pale blonde hair pulled back in the severe style of Amish girls, and deep blue eyes that seemed to hold far too much knowledge for her age. Her dark blue dress and black apron were clean but worn, obviously hand-me-downs from an older child. She clutched a small fabric doll against her chest, a simple thing made from scraps, with button eyes and yellow yarn hair. "Amos," Bishop Kurtz said, extending his hand. "Thank you for seeing us." Amos shook the offered hand, his eyes moving between the bishop and the child. "Bishop, what brings you out this morning?" "This is Grace," the bishop said, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Grace Miller, from the settlement in Brush Valley. She's in need of a home." The words hung in the air between them. Amos looked down at Grace, who stared back at him with those unsettling blue eyes. She didn't smile, didn't speak, just watched him with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that adults could disappoint, could leave, could break promises without warning. "I'm not the man for this," Amos said quietly. "Surely there. Our family's better suited." "There are families," Bishop Kurtz agreed, "but they have children of their own, mouths already stringing their tables. And Grace," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "Grace has had a difficult time. She needs patience, understanding. She needs someone who knows the weight of loss." Amos felt something twist in his chest. He didn't want to know this child's story, didn't want to understand the shadows in her eyes. He built his life around avoiding exactly this kind of pain. "Our parents died 6 months ago," the bishop continued, his voice gentle but firm. "Buggy accident on the Brush Valley Road. Grace was with her aunt and uncle, but they've taken ill tuberculosis. They can't care for her now." The child shifted slightly, her grip tightening on the doll. Amos noticed her shoes were too large, probably borrowed like the dress. Her fingernails were bitten short, and there was a small scar on her chin that spoke of childhood mishaps in a world that suddenly offered no one to kiss away the hurt. "I don't know anything about raising children," Amos said, but even as he spoke, he could hear the weakness in his protest. "I'm too old, too set in my ways." "You're 58, Bishop Kurtz said with a slight smile. "Abraham was older when Isaac was born. That was different. That was God's plan, and this might be as well." They stood in silence for a moment, 3 people caught in the morning light, each carrying their own burden of loss and hope. Grace continued to watch Amos with those steady eyes, and he found himself remembering Martha's face in the early days of her illness, the same combination of strength and vulnerability. The same quiet courage in the face of an uncertain future. "I can pay for her keep," Bishop Kurtz said. "The community will help with clothing, schooling. You wouldn't be alone in this." Amos looked at Grace again. She was such a small thing. This orphan child who'd lost everything twice over. He thought of his empty house, his silent meals, his days measured only by the sun's passage across the sky. He thought of Martha's final words, her plea for him to keep living, to find purpose again. "How long?" he asked. "Until she's of age to marry, if you're willing. Or until we can find another arrangement that suits better." Grace spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't be any trouble." The words hit Amos like a physical blow. This child, who'd lost parents and home and the very foundation of her world, was worried about being trouble. He looked down at her, really looked, and saw beneath the carefully composed exterior to the frightened little girl underneath. "What do you like to do?" he asked, crouching down to her level. Grace blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "I like to help," she said carefully. "I can gather eggs. I can sweep. I'm learning to milk goats. Do you like to read?" Her face brightened slightly. "Yes, sir. My mama taught me some letters." Amos nodded, standing slowly. He looked at Bishop Kurtz, who waited with the patience of a man accustomed to watching people wrestle with difficult decisions. "1 month," Amos said finally. "We'll try for 1 month. See how we manage." Relief flickered across the bishop's weathered features. "That's all we ask." Grace said nothing, but her death grip on the doll loosened slightly. She looked up at the farmhouse with its weathered siding and peaceful setting, then back at Amos with something that might have been hoped on. As Bishop Kurtz prepared to leave, he pulled Amos aside. "She has nightmares," he said quietly, "about the accident. She saw it happen. And she doesn't talk much, hasn't said more than a few words at a time since her parents died. But she's a good child, Amos, strong, like her mother was." Amos nodded, watching as Grace explored the edge of the porch, her small hands trailing along the railing. "I'll do my best," he said, though he wasn't sure what his best might be worth to a traumatized child. After the bishop left, Amos and Grace stood looking at each other across the width of the porch. The morning sun climbed higher, promising another warm day. Somewhere in the barn, a cow lowed softly. The normal sounds of the farm continued around them, indifferent to this moment of decision. "Are you hungry?" Amos asked. Grace shook her head, then seemed to reconsider. "A little." "Well then," he said, opening the screen door. "Let's see what we can find." As Grace stepped into Martha's kitchen for the first time, Amos felt the house shift around them, as if the very walls were adjusting to accommodate new life. It would take time to understand what that meant for both of them. But for now, it was enough. The small girl had a place to sleep, and a man who'd forgotten how to hope had remembered, just for a moment, what it felt like to be needed. 3 days passed in careful, quiet orbits around each other. Grace ate her meals without complaint, helped with simple chores, and spent long hours sitting on the porch steps, watching the world beyond the farm. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then in whispers, as if afraid her voice might disturb the profound silence that had settled over the Hostetter farm like dust on unused furniture. Amos found himself walking more softly, speaking more gently, hyper-aware of his movements in a way he hadn't been since Martha's illness. The child was like a small, wild creature that might flee at any sudden sound. He'd given her the spare bedroom upstairs, the room he and Martha had once planned for children of their own. Grace had thanked him politely and closed the door, and he hadn't seen inside since. On the 4th morning, Amos was replacing a broken board on the chicken coop when he heard the crash from inside the house. Not loud. Grace seemed incapable of making loud noises, but the distinct sound of something wooden hitting the kitchen floor. He set down his hammer and walked quickly toward the house, his mind running through possibilities. He found Grace in the kitchen, frozen in place beside the overturned wooden box that had spilled its contents across the linoleum floor. Recipe cards scattered in all directions, dozens of them, covered in Martha's careful handwriting, some stained with use, others crisp and new from experiments she'd never gotten to try. Grace stood among them like a deer caught in headlights, her face pale with what looked like terror. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice so quiet he barely heard it. "I was just looking. I didn't mean to." "It's all right," Amos said, but the words came out sharper than he intended. The sight of Martha's recipe box, her most treasured possession, spread across the floor like fallen leaves sent a spike of protective anger through his chest. He'd kept that box exactly where she'd left it, on the high shelf above the stove, untouched for 15 years. Grace flinched at his tone and immediately dropped to her knees, frantically gathering the scattered cards. Her hands shook as she tried to stack them, but the tears that had started to fall made it difficult to see what she was doing. "Don't," Amos said, the word coming out harder than he meant. "Just don't touch them." Grace jerked her hands back, as if the cards had burned her. She scrambled backward until her spine hit the kitchen cabinet, making herself as small as possible. The fear in her eyes raw, absolute terror stopped Amos cold. This wasn't a child who'd been scolded too harshly. This was a child who'd learned to expect the worst from adults, who knew that anger could lead to abandonment or worse. Amos took a deep breath, forcing his voice to gentle. "I'm not angry at you, Grace. These cards, they belong to my wife. They're precious to me." Grace nodded rapidly, still pressed against the cabinet. "I know. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. What were you looking for?" She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "I was hungry, and I thought maybe there was something I could make. I saw the box and thought maybe." She stopped, swallowing hard. "My mama had cards like these. She taught me to read them. I thought maybe I could read yours." The simple honesty of it hit Amos like a physical blow. A hungry child looking for something to eat, reminded of her dead mother by a box of recipes. He looked down at the scattered cards, Martha's neat handwriting documenting years of love expressed through food. Apple butter, shoe-fly pie, chicken and dumplings. Bread that could make a man weep with gratitude. Slowly, carefully, Amos lowered himself to the floor beside Grace. She tensed as he moved closer, but didn't flee. Up close, he could see how thin she'd gotten, how her dress hung loose on her small frame. When had she last had a proper meal? When had anyone cared enough to make sure she was fed? "This one," he said, picking up a card spotted with brown stains. This was her apple butter recipe. She made it every fall from the trees in the back orchard. Grace leaned slightly closer, her curiosity overcoming her fear. What do the stains mean? They mean she used this recipe so many times that it got messy. See here? He pointed to a brown fingerprint in the corner. That's from her hands, from all the time she touched this card while she was cooking. Grace studied the card with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient text. My mama's cards had stains too. She said they were love marks. The phrase hit Amos in a place he'd kept carefully protected for 15 years. Love marks. Of course, that's what they were. Every stain, every smudge, every tiny tear in the cardboard was evidence of care, of time spent nurturing others, of love expressed through the simple act of feeding people. "What happened to your mama's cards?" he asked. Grace's face crumpled slightly. "They burned in the fire. After the accident, there was a fire in our kitchen. Aunt Ruth tried to save them, but she shrugged with the fatalistic acceptance of a child who'd learned that loss was simply part of life." Amos looked at the card in his hands, then at the small girl beside him who'd lost so much that the sight of someone else's recipes could bring her to tears. Martha's words echoed in his memory. "Grief is love with nowhere to go." But maybe that wasn't entirely true. Maybe sometimes love could find new places to land. "Would you like me to teach you this one?" he asked. Grace's eyes widened. "You mean we could make apple butter?" "The apples aren't quite ready yet. But when they are, yes, we could make apple butter." For the first time since she'd arrived, Grace smiled, a small thing, tentative and fragile, but real. Really? Really. But first, Amos gathered another handful of recipe cards. "First, we should probably make something for lunch. Are you truly hungry?" Grace nodded, her stomach choosing that moment to growl audibly. Amos chuckled, the first time he'd made that sound in longer than he could remember. "Well then, let's see what Martha would recommend." He shuffled through the cards until he found the one he was looking for. "Here, potato soup. Simple, filling, and perfect for a day like today." They spent the next hour reading through the recipe. Together, Grace sounding out the words she didn't know while Amos explained measurements and techniques. She was a quick learner, eager to understand not just what to do, but why. Why did the onions go in first? Why did you add the milk slowly? Why was the wooden spoon better than the metal one? As they worked, something shifted in the kitchen. The profound silence that had characterized Amos's life began to crack, filled with Grace's questions and his answers, with the gentle sounds of chopping and stirring and the gradual warming of soup on the stove. When Grace accidentally dropped a potato and it rolled across the floor, instead of terror, she looked at Amos with concern, worried she'd made a mistake, but not afraid of punishment. "Just rinse it off," he said. "Food that touches the floor doesn't become poison." When the soup was ready, they sat at the kitchen table, the first time Amos had eaten there since Martha died. He'd taken all his meals standing at the counter, or sitting on the porch, unable to bear the sight of Martha's empty chair. But with Grace sitting across from him, carefully blowing on her spoonful of soup, the table felt less like a monument to loss and more like what it was supposed to be, a place where people came together to share food and conversation. "It tastes like my mama's," Grace said after her first tentative sip. "Your mama was a good cook?" "The best. She could make anything taste wonderful, even turnips." Grace paused, considering. "Do you miss your wife when you cook?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that Amos had no defenses against it. "Yes," he said simply. "I miss her most when I cook. That's why I stopped making real meals." Grace nodded as if this made perfect sense. Maybe she wanted someone to use her recipes again. Maybe that's why I found them. Amos looked at this small, wise child who'd lost as much as he had, but somehow retained the ability to see possibility in tragedy. "Maybe she did," he said quietly, as they finished their soup in comfortable silence. Amos felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. The simple pleasure of sharing a meal with someone who mattered. Grace had taken Martha's scattered recipes and, in her innocent desire to help, had begun to gather not just the cards, but something much more precious. The love that had created them in the first place. When they cleaned up the dishes together, Amos carefully placed Martha's recipe box on the kitchen counter where Grace could reach it. "These belong to both of us now," he said. "Whenever you're hungry, whenever you want to cook something, you can look through them. But," he paused, meeting her eyes, "be careful with them. They're all I have left of her kitchen magic." Grace nodded solemnly. "I'll treat them like love marks," she promised. And in that moment, Amos understood that healing didn't mean forgetting or replacing what was lost. It meant finding new ways to honor love, new places for it to grow and flourish. Grace hadn't disturbed Martha's memory by touching those recipe cards. She'd awakened it. The morning routine began to change in small ways. Grace appeared in the kitchen each day at sunrise, dressed and ready to help with whatever needed doing. She'd learned to make coffee the way Amos liked it, black and strong, and she set out his breakfast things without being asked. In return, He started making enough food for two, and they ate together in companionable silence as the world woke up around them. Grace proved to be a natural with the animals. The chickens, skittish around Amos despite years of care, flocked to her like she was their long-lost mother. She named them all Henrietta, Cordelia, Brunhild, and spoke to them in soft murmurs as she scattered their feed each morning. The goats, particularly the ornery old buck named Thunder, gentled under her touch in ways that amazed Amos. "How do you do that?" he asked one morning, watching as Thunder, who'd never let Amos pet him without a struggle, stood perfectly still while Grace brushed his coat. "I just listen to what they're telling me," Grace said, as if this explained everything. "Thunder's not mean. He's just scared that people will hurt him if he's not strong enough." Amos studied the child's serious face, wondering what kind of wisdom came from losing your parents at 7 years old. Grace seemed to understand things about fear and protection that most adults never learned. After the morning tours, Amos found himself walking Grace around the farm, showing her things he hadn't thought about in years. The old swimming hole in the creek where he'd learned to fish as a boy. The lightning-struck oak where he proposed to Martha 43 years ago. The small family cemetery where his parents and grandparents rested under simple stone markers. "Where is your wife buried?" Grace asked as they stood among the weathered headstones. Amos pointed to the newest grave, marked with a plain stone that read simply, "Martha Hostetter, beloved wife, 1952 to 2010. Grace approached it slowly, the way she approached everything, with careful respect and quiet attention. "Did you love her very much?" she asked. "More than my own life," Amos said, without hesitation. Grace knelt beside the grave and placed her small hand on the stone. "My papa said that about my mama, too. He said love doesn't die when people do. It just changes shape." The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond their simple truth. Amos looked at this child who spoke about love and death with equal measure of acceptance and wisdom, and felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight grip he'd kept on his grief for so long. That afternoon, Grace discovered his workshop in the barn. Amos had built the small space shortly after marrying Martha, intending to craft furniture for the children they'd hoped to have. Over the years, it had become his retreat, a place to work with his hands when his mind needed quiet. But like so many parts of his life, he'd abandoned it after Martha's death. "What's all this?" Grace asked, running her fingers over the dust-covered workbench. "Tools," Amos said, following her into the dim space, "for making things from wood." Grace picked up a small hand plane, testing its weight. "What kinds of things?" "Furniture, mostly. Cabinets, tables, toys." He paused, remembering. "I made Martha a hope chest when we were courting. Carved roses into the lid because she loved roses. Do you still have it?" "It's upstairs in our inn. My bedroom." Grace set down the plane and moved to the pegboard where Amos's father's tools hung in neat rows. Chisels and gouges, hammers and awls, each one worn smooth by generations of use. These tools had built barns and houses, crafted cradles and coffins, shaped the wood that sheltered and served their community for over a century. "My grandpa was a carpenter," Grace said quietly, "before he got sick. He was teaching my papa, and papa was going to teach me when I got big enough. Would you like to learn now?" The words surprised Amos as much as they did Grace. He hadn't planned to offer, hadn't even consciously decided to resurrect his woodworking. But looking at Grace's face, the careful hope that flickered there, he realized he wanted to teach her, wanted to pass on something valuable, something that would outlast them both. "Could I really?" she asked. "We'd start simple. Maybe a small box for your treasures, something to keep your doll safe." Grace clutched the fabric doll she still carried everywhere. "She doesn't have a safe place to sleep," she admitted. "I'm afraid she'd get lost if I don't hold her." That evening, after the supper dishes were washed and put away, Amos led Grace back to the workshop. He lit the oil lamp and cleared space on the workbench, then selected a piece of pine soft enough for small hands to work with but strong enough to last. "First lesson," he said, handing Grace a piece of sandpaper. "Wood has to be smooth before you can build with it. Feel here." He guided her hand along the board's surface. "You can feel where it's rough, where it needs more work." Grace bent over the task with the same intense concentration she brought to everything else. Her small hands moved the sandpaper in careful, even strokes, pausing frequently to check her progress with her fingertips. Amos found himself remembering his own father's hands guiding his, the satisfaction of feeling rough wood transform under patient effort. "Why does it have to be so smooth?" Grace asked. "Because rough edges hurt people, and because something made with care should feel good to touch." Grace nodded seriously, understanding that he was talking about more than just woodworking. They worked in comfortable silence, the soft rasp of sandpaper the only sound besides the barn cats settling in the hayloft overhead. When the pine was smooth enough, Amos showed Grace how to measure and mark, how to hold a pencil so the lines would be straight and true. Her measurements weren't perfect, but they were careful, each line considered and reconsidered before she committed to it. "My papa used to say that measuring twice saves crying once," she said, checking her marks again. "Your papa was a wise man." As they put away the tools for the night, Grace looked around the workshop with new eyes. "Will you teach me to use the big tools too, when I'm bigger?" "If you want to learn, I'll teach you everything I know," Amos said. "These tools have been in my family for 3 generations. They're meant to be used, meant to create things that matter." Walking back to the house under the star-filled sky, Grace slipped her hand into his, the first time she'd initiated any physical contact. Her fingers were small and calloused from farm work, but warm and trusting. "Papa Amos?" she said, quietly. The name hit him like a gentle blow to the chest. Papa Amos, not Mr. Hostetter, not just Amos, but Papa. When had that happened? When had this orphan child decided he was worth calling family? "Yes, Grace? Thank you for teaching me things. Mama said that when grown-ups teach children, they're passing on love that never ends." Amos squeezed her hand gently, not trusting his voice to carry words. In the space of a few weeks, this small girl had managed to breach walls he'd spent 15 years building. She'd taken his silence and filled it with questions, his emptiness and filled it with purpose, his careful isolation and transformed it into something that felt remarkably like hope. As they reached the kitchen door, Grace looked up at him with those serious blue eyes. "Are you glad I found your wife's recipes?" "Yes," Amos said, and meant it completely. "I'm very glad you did." 2 weeks into Grace's stay, Amos discovered she could barely read beyond the simple words on Martha's recipe cards. During their evening meal, he watched her struggle with a notice from the local school district about enrollment requirements, her finger tracing under each word as she tried to sound out the letters. "Grace," he said gently, "when did you last attend school?" Her cheeks reddened. "I went sometimes before Mama and Papa died." "But after?" She shrugged, the gesture conveying months of upheaval and uncertainty. "Aunt Ruth was too sick to take me, and Uncle John said girls don't need much learning anyway." Amos felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, not at Grace, but at a world that could overlook a bright child's need for education, simply because she was female and orphaned. In his own family, his mother had been the one who taught him to read, who showed him that learning was a gift that no one could take away. "Would you like me to teach you?" he asked. Grace's eyes widened. "You'd do that? Even though I'm just what? Just a girl who's staying here for a while." The casual way she dismissed her own worth broke something in Amos's chest. "Grace, you're not just anything. You're a bright child who deserves to read and write and cipher as well as any boy. And you're not staying here for a while. You're—" He paused, realizing what he was about to say. "You're home now." That night, Amos climbed to the attic and retrieved the primer Martha had used to teach Sunday school children years ago. The pages were yellowed but intact, filled with simple sentences and moral lessons appropriate for young minds. He also found a slate and chalk, a bottle of ink, and several practice books with ruled lines for forming letters. The next evening after supper, he cleared the kitchen table and set out the materials. Grace approached the makeshift classroom with the same careful attention she brought to everything else, settling into her chair with her back straight and her hands folded. "We'll start with letters you already know," Amos said, opening the primer to the first page. "Tell me what you see here." Grace studied the page, pointing to letters she recognized. "A B, that one, C." She paused at the fourth letter, her brow furrowed in concentration. "D," Amos said gently. "Like dog or door or doll," Grace finished, smiling. "Like my doll." They worked through the alphabet slowly, Grace repeating each letter's sound until she could produce it without hesitation. Her hunger for learning was evident in the way she leaned forward, the intensity of her focus, the careful questions she asked about letter combinations and pronunciation. "Why does the C sometimes sound like S?" she asked, puzzled by the word. "Center. English is a stubborn language," Amos said. It borrowed words from many other languages, and sometimes it kept their old pronunciations. The important thing is to remember the patterns. Within a week, Grace was reading simple sentences aloud. Her finger no longer needed to trace under each word. Amos found himself looking forward to their evening lessons as much as she did. There was something deeply satisfying about watching, understanding dawn in her eyes, about seeing her confidence grow with each successfully decoded page. "You're a natural teacher," Grace said one evening as they finished a particularly challenging passage about farm animals. "Did you ever teach school?" "No," Amos said. "But my mother taught me that sharing knowledge is one of the highest callings. She said that every time you teach someone something true and useful, you're fighting back against ignorance and despair." Grace considered this seriously. "Mama used to say something like that. She said learning was like lighting candles. You can light as many as you want from one flame, and the first candle never gets dimmer." As autumn deepened into early winter, their evening routine became sacred. After supper and dishes, they'd clear the table and spread out their books and materials. Grace would read aloud from the primer while Amos listened and helped with difficult words. Then they'd practice writing, Grace's small hand gripping the pencil with determined concentration as she formed her letters. Her penmanship improved quickly, the shaky letters gradually becoming more confident and uniform. Amos taught her to write her full name, Grace Miller, though something in him wished she could write Grace Hostetter instead. The thought surprised him with its intensity. When had he begun thinking of her as his own child? "Papa Amos, Grace said one evening as they worked on arithmetic, "What happens when I know everything in this book? Then we'll find more books. Learning never ends, Grace. There's always something new to discover, always another skill to master." Grace smiled at this prospect rather than being daunted by it. "Good. I like learning new things." The transformation in Grace was remarkable. The frightened, silent child who'd arrived a month ago was blossoming into someone curious and confident. She asked questions about everything. Why did cows need to be milked twice a day? How did the windmill know which way to turn? What made the sunrise red some mornings and yellow others? Amos found himself seeing his own world through fresh eyes. As he tried to answer her questions, things he'd taken for granted for decades suddenly required explanation, and in explaining them, he rediscovered his own wonder at the complexity and beauty of farm life. But it was during the third week of their evening lessons that the nightmare came. Amos woke to the sound of screaming roar, terrified cries that seemed to tear through the fabric of the night. He was out of bed and running toward Grace's room before he was fully awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found her sitting bolt upright in bed, her eyes wide and unseeing, her small body shaking with sobs. The fabric doll lay forgotten beside her pillow as she fought against some invisible terror. "Grace," he said softly, approaching the bed carefully. "Grace, you're safe. You're home." She didn't seem to hear him. Her cries continued, wordless sounds of absolute anguish that cut through Amos like a blade. He sat on the edge of the bed and spoke quietly, steadily, telling her she was safe, that he was there, that nothing could hurt her. Gradually, her sobs quieted and her breathing slowed. Her eyes focused on his face, confusion replacing terror. "Papa Amos," she whispered, "I'm here, little one. You had a bad dream." Grace looked around the unfamiliar room as if surprised to find herself there. I thought I was back in the buggy. I could hear the horses screaming and Mama crying, and she dissolved into tears again. But these were different. The helpless grief of a child who'd seen too much. Amos gathered her into his arms without thinking, holding her slight frame against his chest as she wept. She felt so small, so fragile, like a bird with broken wings. How had he forgotten that beneath her quiet competence and wise observations, she was still just a 7-year-old child carrying a burden no adult should bear? "Tell me about the dream," he said when her crying subsided. "It's always the same," Grace whispered against his shoulder. "We're driving to town for supplies, and Mama's telling me about the baby. She was going to have a baby. Did you know? And then there's this loud noise and the buggy tips over and the horses are hurt, and Mama can't wake up and Papa's calling my name, but I can't reach him and—" "Shh," Amos murmured, rocking her gently. "It's over now. You're safe here with me. But what if it happens again? What if something happens to you too?" The fear in her voice was so naked, so raw, that Amos felt his own eyes fill with tears. This child had lost everyone she'd ever loved, had been passed from relative to relative like an unwanted burden. Of course, she was terrified of losing him too. "Nothing is going to happen to me," he said firmly. "I'm healthy and careful, and I'm not going anywhere, but you can't promise that." Nobody can promise that. She was right, and they both knew it. Death came when it chose, without regard for promises or plans or the hearts it would break. But looking down at Grace's tear-stained face, Amos knew he had to offer her something stronger than mere hope. "You're right," he said. "I can't promise I'll live forever, but I can promise that as long as I'm here, you'll have a home with me. And I can promise that if something does happen to me, I'll make sure you're cared for by people who love you." Grace studied his face in the lamplight, weighing his words. "Do you love me, Papa Amos?" The question hung between them like a bridge. Across an impossible chasm, Amos looked at this small girl who'd wandered into his carefully guarded life and somehow made herself essential to it. When had that happened? When had her happiness become more important than his solitude, her security more precious than his? Self-protection? Yes, he said simply. "I love you very much." Grace's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. She settled back against his chest with a sigh that seemed to release months of held breath. "I love you too, Papa Amos, more than anybody except Mama and Papa." They sat together in the quiet darkness, Grace's breathing gradually returning to normal as she found her way back to sleep. Amos held her until he was certain the nightmare had passed, then tucked her under the quilts and kissed her forehead. The first time he'd done such a thing since Martha died. As he returned to his own room, Amos realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer a lonely widower and an orphan child sharing space out of necessity. They had become what Grace had been calling them all along: family. The next morning, Grace appeared at breakfast with shadows under her eyes, but a determined set to her small shoulders. She made coffee, and set out breakfast as usual. But there was a new quality to her movements, a sense of belonging that hadn't been there before. "Papa Amos," she said as they sat down to eat, "when I learn to read really well, will you help me write a letter to Mama and Papa?" "Even though they can't read it?" "Of course," Amos said. "What would you want to tell them?" "That I'm safe. That I found someone who loves me. That I'm learning important things and becoming the person they wanted me to be." She paused, considering. "And that you're teaching me to be careful with love marks." Amos smiled, remembering her phrase for the stains on Martha's recipe cards. "I think they'd be very happy to know all of that." As they finished breakfast and prepared for the day's work, Amos felt a deep sense of rightness settle over him. Grace belonged here, in this kitchen, on this farm, in his life. Whatever legal arrangements needed to be made, whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them. Because sometime in the past month, without his quite realizing it, this orphaned child had stopped being a temporary responsibility and had become his daughter in all the ways that mattered most. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came Grace's discovery of Martha's garden journal. She found it on a warm March morning while exploring the small shed behind the house, tucked away on a shelf between packets of old seeds and coils of twine. The leather-bound book was water-stained and faded, but Martha's careful handwriting was still legible on every page. "Papa Amos, look what I found," Grace called, running toward the barn where Amos was repairing a broken stall door. He looked up from his work to see Grace clutching the journal against her chest, her face bright with excitement. The sight of that particular book sent a sharp pang through his chest. Martha had kept meticulous records of every planting season, what grew well, what failed, which varieties produced the best yields. She'd planned each year's garden like a general planning a campaign, consulting seed catalogs and weather patterns and the wisdom passed down from her mother and grandmother. "Where did you find that?" he asked, setting down his hammer. "In the shed. There are packets of seeds, too, all labeled in the same handwriting." Grace opened the journal carefully, treating it with the reverence she'd learned to show for precious things. Look, she drew pictures of everything. Tomatoes, beans, carrots. She even wrote down when to plant and when to harvest. Amos took the journal from her hands, his fingers automatically finding the page that marked Martha's final entry. May 15th, 2010, just 2 months before the cancer took her. She'd been planning the fall garden even as her body was failing, making notes about which apple trees needed pruning and reminders to save seeds from the best tomato plants. She loved her garden, he said quietly. Spent every morning there, from first thaw until the last harvest. Grace looked toward the area behind the house where Martha's garden had once flourished. Now it was an overgrown tangle of weeds and volunteer trees. The careful rows and neat paths long since disappeared under nature's relentless advance. Could we make it grow again? She asked, thought the question hit Amos like a physical blow. Martha's garden had been her sanctuary, her creative expression, her gift to their family and community. In the months after her death, he'd tried to maintain it, but every plant that withered under his inexperienced care felt like another small death. Eventually, he'd simply let it go wild, unable to bear the constant reminder of his inadequacy. "I don't know anything about gardening," he said. Martha was the one with the green thumb. "But she wrote everything down," Grace said, flipping through the journal's pages. "Look, she tells exactly what to do and when to do it. It's like having her teach us." Grace's optimism was infectious, but Amos felt only the familiar weight of old failure. Gardens need more than instructions, Grace. They need intuition, understanding, a feel for what plants need. "I killed everything I touched after Martha died. Maybe that's because you were sad and the plants could feel it," Grace said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that never failed to surprise him. "But you're not as sad now, and I could help." I'm good with growing things. I kept Aunt Ruth's herb garden alive, even when she was too sick to care for it. Amos looked at this small girl, who faced every challenge with such determined hope. Grace had been working alongside him for months now, and he'd seen her gentle touch with animals, her patience with difficult tasks, her ability to coax life from the most unlikely places. Maybe she was right. Maybe the garden had failed because he'd approached it with grief instead of love. It would be a lot of work, he warned. The whole area would need to be cleared, the soil prepared, fencing repaired to keep the deer out. I don't mind work, Grace said. And look, she opened the journal to a page titled Garden Planning and pointed to Martha's neat diagrams. She drew maps of where everything should go. We could follow her plans exactly. That afternoon, they walked the boundaries of what had once been Martha's pride and joy. The space was larger than Amos remembered, nearly a quarter-acre of rich bottomland protected from harsh winds by the barn and a line of sugar maples. Underneath a tangle of weeds and brambles, he could still see traces of Martha's original layout, the remains of trellises for climbing beans, the curved borders of what had been herb beds, the skeletal framework of the greenhouse she'd built from salvaged windows. This must have been beautiful, Grace said, pulling aside a curtain of wild grapevines to reveal the greenhouse's weathered frame. It was Martha's masterpiece, Amos said. She could grow anything vegetables that fed. Thus, year-round, flowers that made the whole yard smell like heaven, herbs that could cure whatever ailed you. Grace opened the journal to a page labeled First-Year Mistakes and read aloud. Planted tomatoes too early, lost entire crop to late frost. Note: patience is the gardener's greatest virtue. The earth knows its own timing. She sounds wise, Grace said. She was. About everything, but especially about growing things. Amos knelt and picked up a handful of the dark soil, letting it run through his fingers. Even after 15 years of neglect, the earth here was rich and loamy, full of organic matter from decades of Martha's careful composting. This soil remembers her, he said, more to himself than to Grace. Then maybe it will remember how to grow good things again, Grace said, if we treat it the way she did. They spent the rest of the afternoon reading through Martha's journal together, Grace asking questions about terms she didn't understand while Amos explained the reasoning behind Martha's methods. Crop rotation to prevent soil depletion, companion planting to discourage pests naturally, the careful balance of nitrogen and phosphorus that kept plants healthy without forcing unnatural growth. She really did think of everything, Grace marveled, studying a detailed chart that tracked which varieties performed best in which conditions. Martha believed that gardening was a conversation with the earth, Amos said. You had to listen to what the soil and plants were telling you, adjust your plans based on what you observed. She said that's what separated real gardeners from people who just stuck seeds in the ground and hoped for the best. As the sun began to set, Grace closed the journal and looked up at Amos with those serious blue eyes. Will you teach me to have that conversation? Will you help me learn what Martha knew? Amos felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the grief that had kept him from touching anything Martha had loved. Grace wasn't asking him to replace Martha or to somehow become the gardener his wife had been. She was asking him to honor Martha's legacy by passing on her knowledge, by keeping her wisdom alive in new hands. We'll start tomorrow, he said. But Grace, this isn't something we can rush. Gardens teach patience above all else. We'll make mistakes, probably kill some plants, definitely get frustrated. That's okay, Grace said confidently. Martha wrote about her mistakes too. Maybe that's how we'll learn, by doing things wrong until we figure out how to do them right. As they walked back toward the house, Amos found himself seeing the neglected garden not as a monument to his failure, but as an opportunity for renewal. Grace was right. The soil remembered Martha's care, and perhaps it was ready to respond. to love again. Perhaps they both were. That evening, as they sat at the kitchen table planning their garden restoration, Amos felt Martha's presence more strongly than he had in years, not as a ghost or a painful memory, but as a gentle guide whose wisdom lived on in the pages of her journal and the eager questions of a 7-year-old girl who believed that anything was possible with enough patience and care. "Papa Amos," Grace said as they prepared for bed, "do you think Martha would be happy about us bringing her garden back to life?" Amos thought of his wife's joy in sharing her knowledge, her delight in teaching anyone who showed interest in growing things. "I think she'd be thrilled," he said. "And I think she'd be especially proud that you're the one asking to learn." By late spring, Grace had transformed from the silent, fearful child who'd arrived 6 months ago into a confident member of both the Hostetter household and the broader Amish community. Her reading had progressed to the point where she could tackle simple stories on her own, and her arithmetic skills impressed even the most traditional community members who believed girls needed little formal education. More importantly, Grace had begun to heal from the trauma of losing her parents. The nightmares still came occasionally, but less frequently and with less intensity. She spoke about her mother and father with love rather than devastating grief, sharing memories that made her smile instead of cry. Amos took quiet pride in the role he'd played in this transformation, though he knew the real credit belonged to Grace's own resilient spirit. The garden project had become their shared obsession. Working side by side in the early morning hours before the day grew too hot, they'd cleared acres of weeds and brambles, repaired the greenhouse frame, and begun the careful process of restoring Martha's elaborate planting beds. Grace approached each task with the same methodical patience she brought to her lessons, consulting Martha's journal before making any decisions and asking Amos to explain the reasoning behind each step, that it was during one of these garden work sessions that Hannah Byler first appeared at their gate. Amos was teaching Grace to build a trellis for climbing beans when he noticed a familiar figure walking up their lane. Hannah was a widow in her early 50s, with graying brown hair tucked neatly under her prayer-covering and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. Her husband had died 3 years earlier in a farming accident, leaving her to raise their youngest son alone. She was known throughout the community for her gentle nature and excellent cooking, and Amos had always found her company pleasant during the brief conversations they'd shared at church gatherings. "Good morning, Amos," Hannah called as she approached. "I hope I'm not disturbing your work." "Not at all," Amos replied, setting down his hammer. "Grace, this is Mrs. Byler. Hannah, this is Grace." Grace performed a small curtsy, as she'd been taught. "Good morning, Mrs. Byler." "Please, call me Hannah," the woman said with a warm smile. "I've heard so much about you from the other ladies. They say you're quite the little scholar." Grace beamed at the praise. "Papa Amos is teaching me to read and cipher, and we're bringing back his wife's garden using her journal." Hannah's eyes moved from the restored garden beds to the journal Grace clutched in her soil-stained hands. "What a wonderful way to honor her memory," she said softly. "Martha had the most beautiful garden in the county. I still remember the tomatoes she brought to the church suppers. They were like nothing I'd ever tasted." "The secret was in the composting," Grace said seriously, repeating something she'd learned from Martha's notes. She composted everything: kitchen scraps, barn waste, even fallen leaves. She said good soil was the foundation of everything. "Very wise," Hannah agreed. "I struggle with my own garden. Nothing I grow seems to thrive the way it should." "Maybe you could visit us when our vegetables are ready," Grace suggested with characteristic generosity. "Papa Amos and I could show you what Martha's journal taught us." Amos felt a flush of warmth at Grace's easy assumption that he belonged in any conversation about gardening expertise. 6 months ago, he couldn't have imagined discussing Martha's methods with anyone, let alone offering to teach them. But Grace's enthusiasm had somehow made it possible to share Martha's knowledge without feeling like he was betraying her memory. "I'd like that very much," Hannah said. "If Amos doesn't mind the intrusion." "It wouldn't be an intrusion," Amos found himself saying. Martha always believed gardening knowledge should be shared. She'd have wanted her methods to help other people grow good food. As they talked, Amos noticed how Grace seemed to naturally position herself between him and Hannah. Identify. It wasn't until Hannah was preparing to leave that he realized what it was matchmaking. "Hannah," Grace said, as the woman gathered her basket, "do you know how to make apple butter?" "Papa Amos promised to teach me when the apples are ready, but I think it would be more fun with more people." Hannah glanced at Amos with something that might have been hope. "I'd be honored to help, if Amos agrees." "Of course," Amos said, though something in his chest tightened at the thought. Making apple butter had been one of Martha's favorite traditions, something they'd done together every fall for 30 years. The idea of sharing that ritual with someone else felt both natural and terrifying. After Hannah left, Grace threw herself back into the garden work with renewed energy. But Amos noticed her stealing glances at him, clearly gauging his reaction to their visitor. "She seems nice," Grace said carefully as they resumed work on the bean trellis. "She is nice," Amos agreed. "Hannah's a good woman, a faithful member of our community. And she's pretty." Amos nearly dropped his hammer. "Grace, she is," Grace insisted. "And she looked at you the way Mama used to look at Papa when she thought." He wasn't watching. The observation hit Amos like a physical blow. Grace was only 7 years old, but she'd clearly inherited her mother's gift for reading people's emotions. Had Hannah been looking at him that way? And if so, what was he supposed to do about it? "Grace," he said carefully, "I think you might be imagining things." "I'm not," Grace said with absolute certainty. "And Papa's," she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I think it would be okay if you liked her too. Mama always said that love doesn't run out when you share it. Maybe it's the same with grown-up love." That evening, as they sat at the kitchen table working on Grace's arithmetic lesson, Amos found his mind wandering to Hannah's visit. There had been something different about the way she'd spoken to him, a warmth that went beyond neighborly courtesy. And he'd enjoyed her company in a way that surprised him, not just as a break from routine, but as something genuinely pleasant. The realization troubled him more than he cared to admit. For 15 years, the idea of caring for another woman had seemed impossible, even disloyal to Martha's memory. His grief had been so complete, so defining, that he couldn't imagine room for anyone else in his heart. But Grace's presence had changed something fundamental in him, had awakened parts of his spirit he'd thought were permanently dormant. "Papa Amos," Grace said, interrupting his thoughts, "you're not helping me with this problem." "Sorry," he said, focusing on the arithmetic worksheet in front of her. "What are you struggling with?" "If a farmer has 24 apple trees and each tree produces 6 bushels of apples, how many bushels does he have altogether?" Amos helped her work through the multiplication, but his mind kept drifting to Hannah's kind eyes and the easy way she'd interacted with Grace. What would Martha think about Hannah's obvious interest? Would she approve, or would she feel it was too soon, too much of a betrayal? But as he watched Grace carefully forming numbers on her slate, he remembered Martha's final words. "Promise me you'll keep living, Amos. Promise me you'll find joy." Again. At the time, he'd thought she meant joy in simple things. Sunsets, good harvests, the satisfaction of work well done. But maybe she'd meant something more. Maybe she'd known that 15 years of solitude would be enough. That eventually he'd need human connection beyond the precious bond he was building with Grace. As they prepared for bed that night, Grace looked up at him with those wise blue eyes. "Papa Amos, are you ever lonely?" The question caught him off guard. "Why do you ask?" "Because sometimes you get this look, like you're thinking about sad things. And I thought maybe," she hesitated, "maybe you miss having a grown-up to talk to. I'm good company, but I'm still just a little girl." Amos knelt down to her level, overwhelmed by this child's ability to see straight to the heart of things. "Grace, you're the best company I've ever had. But you're right, sometimes adults need other adults to talk to about grown-up things. Like Hannah? Maybe like Hannah," he admitted. Grace's smile was radiant. "Good, because I think she needs a family too. And we're really good at being a family now." As Amos tucked Grace into bed and kissed her forehead, a ritual that had become as natural as breathing, he realized she was right. They had become a family, complete and loving and strong. Perhaps that strength was what would make it possible to let someone else in, to expand their circle without diminishing what they built together. Looking out Grace's bedroom window at the restored garden beds waiting for their first harvest, Amos felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. Excitement about the future. Not just the immediate future of seeing their vegetables grow and teaching Grace new skills, but the distant future where anything seemed possible. Tomorrow, he decided he would make a point of speaking to Hannah after church, not about anything serious or committed, but just to see where their conversation might lead. Grace deserved to see him fully alive, fully engaged with the world around him, and perhaps, just perhaps, he deserved the same thing. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late June, delivered by a nervous-looking young man in an unfamiliar buggy. Grace was in the garden picking early peas when Amos signed for the certified mail, his stomach already nodding with the instinctive dread that came with official correspondence. The return address read, Fisher and Associates, Legal Services, Holmes County, Ohio. Amos had never heard of Fisher and Associates, but the formal weight of the envelope and the certified delivery suggested trouble. He walked slowly to the kitchen table, Grace's laughter drifting through the open window as she chattered to the chickens while she worked. The letter was brief and coldly professional. Mr. Hostetter, I represent Mr. Caleb Fisher of Walnut Creek, Ohio, regarding custody of his niece, Grace Miller. Mr. Fisher has recently become aware of Grace's current living situation and wishes to provide a proper home for her with blood relatives who can ensure appropriate religious and cultural upbringing. Mr. Fisher will be arriving in Lancaster County on July 10th to collect Grace and assume legal guardianship. Please have her belongings packed and ready for transfer. Any legal documentation regarding your current guardianship arrangement should be prepared for review. This matter is time-sensitive as Mr. Fisher has important business requiring his prompt return to Ohio. Sincerely, Robert Morrison, Amos. Read the letter 3 times, each reading making the words no less devastating. Caleb Fisher. Grace had never mentioned an uncle named Caleb, though she'd spoken occasionally about her father's family in Ohio. Blood relatives, legal guardianship. The clinical language couldn't disguise what this letter really was, a demand to surrender. The child who had become his daughter in every way that mattered. His hand shook as he set the letter down. July 10th was 18 days away. 18 days to prepare for losing Grace, to explain to her that her new life, their life together, was about to be ripped away by a stranger with legal claims. Papa Amos, Grace called from the garden. Come, see how many peas I picked. Amos forced himself to walk outside, to smile and admire Grace's harvest, to act as if his world hadn't just tilted off its axis. Grace knelt among the pea vines, with her skirt spread around her, the bowl beside her filled with bright green pods. Her face was flushed with pride and exertion, and she looked more at home, more completely herself than Amos had ever seen her. That's wonderful, Grace, he managed. Martha's journal was right about this variety. They're producing better than I expected. Grace beamed at the praise, then noticed his expression. Papa Amos, are you feeling poorly? You look pale. Just tired. He lied. Why don't you finish up here while I start lunch? In the kitchen, Amos paced between the stove and the window, his mind racing. What legal standing did he actually have? When Bishop Kurtz had brought Grace to him, there had been no formal papers, no official adoption proceedings. They'd operated on the community's informal understanding that Grace needed a home and Amos could provide one. But in the eyes of the law, he was probably nothing more than a temporary caretaker. Blood relatives. The phrase echoed in his mind like a judgment. Whatever his feelings for Grace, whatever bond they'd forged, she wasn't actually his child. Her uncle had every right to claim her, especially if Amos had no legal documentation of guardianship. When Grace came in with her basket of peas, Amos watched her move around the kitchen with easy familiarity, washing the vegetables at the sink, arranging them in Martha's blue bowl, chattering about her plans for the rest of the garden. This was her home now. She belonged here, thrived here, had found safety and love and purpose within these walls. How could he possibly tell her that it was all about to end? "Papa Amos," Grace said, settling beside him at the table, "you're doing that thing again where you look like you're thinking sad thoughts." Amos realized he couldn't hide this from her, couldn't pretend everything was normal when a stranger was coming to take her away in 18 days. Grace deserved honesty, deserved time to prepare herself for another devastating loss. "Grace," he said carefully, "do you remember your father's family in Ohio? Did he ever mention a brother named Caleb?" Grace's expression grew thoughtful. "Uncle Caleb. I met him once when I was really little. He came for Papa's father's funeral." She paused, clearly trying to remember. Papa didn't like him much. They argued about something, and Mama said Uncle Caleb was more interested in Grandpa's farm than in saying goodbye. Amos felt his stomach sink further. "What do you remember about him?" "Not much. He was loud and he smelled like tobacco. And he kept asking Papa about money, about how much the farm was worth, about what Grandpa left behind." Grace looked up, and Amos was sudden alarm. "Why are you asking about Uncle Caleb?" Amos showed her the letter, watching her face as she slowly read through the formal language. Grace was an excellent reader now, but some of the legal terms were beyond her vocabulary. He explained what the letter meant, that her uncle was coming to take her to Ohio, that he claimed the right to raise her as blood family. Grace's face went white. "He can't," she whispered. "This is my home. You're my family now. Grace, I don't know what legal rights I have. When you came here, there were no official papers, no adoption. But you love me," Grace said, her voice rising with panic. "And I love you. Doesn't that matter more than papers?" Amos gathered her into his arms as she began to cry, not the wild, terrified sobs of her nightmares, but the deeper, more devastating tears of someone facing the loss of everything that had come to matter. He held her while she wept, his own, heartbreaking at the injustice of it all. "We'll fight this," he said when her tears subsided. "I'll talk to Bishop Kurtz, find a lawyer, figure out what options we have." But even as he spoke the words, Amos felt the weight of legal reality pressing down on them. Blood relatives had powerful claims, especially when the alternative guardian had no formal standing. And if this Caleb Fisher was anything like Grace remembered, motivated by money rather than love, he might have resources that a simple Amish farmer couldn't match. That afternoon, while Grace worked listlessly in the garden, Amos hitched up the buggy and drove to Bishop Kurtz's farm. The bishop listened gravely as Amos explained the situation, his weathered face growing more concerned with each detail. "Caleb Fisher," the bishop mused. "I remember hearing about him when the Miller family died. Some question about the estate, about what would happen to the farm since Grace was so young." "What kind of question?" "The kind that usually involves money," Bishop Kurtz said grimly. "Grace's parents owned good land, Amos. 50 acres of prime. farming ground that sold for a substantial sum after their deaths. That money is being held in trust for Grace until she comes of age. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Uncle Caleb wasn't suddenly overcome with concern for his orphan niece's welfare. He was interested in controlling the inheritance. That came with her land money that could solve whatever financial problems a man might have. "How much money?" Amos asked. "Enough to make custody worth pursuing, especially for someone with debts to pay." They discussed the legal options, formal adoption proceedings, character witnesses, documentation of Grace's well-being under Amos's care. But Bishop Kurtz was honest about the challenges they faced. The Amish community generally avoided involving outside legal systems, preferring to handle disputes through church mediation. They had few resources for fighting custody battles in secular courts. "There is one thing," the bishop said as Amos prepared to leave. "Grace herself has a voice in this. At 7, her preferences won't override legal considerations, but judges. Do listen to children, especially when there are questions about the motives of potential guardians." Driving home in the gathering dusk, Amos felt the weight of an impossible situation. In 18 days, a stranger would arrive to claim the child who had become the center of his world. A man who saw Grace not as a beloved daughter, but as a path to financial gain. A man who would take her away from everything she'd learned to love and trust. Grace was waiting on the porch when he returned, her small figure silhouetted against the lamplight spilling from the kitchen. She ran to the buggy before he'd even finished unhitching the horse. "What did Bishop Kurtz say?" she asked. "Can we fight Uncle Caleb? Can we make him leave me alone?" Amos knelt down and took Grace's hands in his. They were calloused now from months of farm work, stronger than when she'd first arrived, but still heartbreakingly small. "We can try," he said honestly. "But Bishop Kurtz is going to help us find a lawyer, someone who understands these kinds of cases. And we'll document everything. How well you're doing here, how much you've learned, how happy you've been. But there's no guarantee," Grace said with the devastating wisdom of a child who'd learned early that life offered no promises. "No," Amos admitted. "There's no guarantee." Grace was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the garden they'd worked so hard to restore. "Papa Amos, what if Uncle Caleb takes me away? What will happen to our garden? Who will harvest Martha's vegetables?" The practical concern, so typical of Grace's thoughtful nature, nearly undid him. She wasn't just worried about being separated from him, she was worried about abandoning their shared responsibilities, leaving their work unfinished. "The garden will wait for you," he said, though they both knew that wasn't true. "And if," he stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "If Uncle Caleb succeeded in taking her, there would be no garden next year, no evening lessons, no shared meals or quiet conversations. There would only be the silence that had defined his life before Grace arrived." That night, Grace climbed into his lap as he sat in Martha's rocking chair, something she hadn't done since her early days on the farm, when nightmares drove her, seeking comfort. She was getting too big for such gestures, but neither of them cared about propriety in the face of impending loss. "Tell me about when you were little," she said, settling against his chest. "Tell me about your papa and mama, about growing up on this farm." Amos talked until his voice grew hoarse, sharing stories he'd never told anyone, memories of learning to milk cows with hands too small to grip properly, of his mother teaching him to read by the light of oil lamps, of the day his father had deemed him old enough to handle the draft horses alone. Grace listened with the intense attention she brought to everything important, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just absorbing the family history that had become, in many ways, her own Dot as she finally drifted off to sleep in his arms. Amos made a silent promise to the child who had saved him from a lifetime of loneliness. Whatever it took, whatever resources he had to marshal, whatever fights he had to wage, he would not let Uncle Caleb take her away. Grace belonged here, with him, in the life they built together from the ruins of their separate losses. That even as he made the promise, Amos felt the cold weight of legal reality settling over them like a winter storm. 18 days to prepare for the most important battle of his life, a battle he wasn't sure he could win. The next 17 days passed in a blur of desperate preparation. Amos found himself caught between the need to maintain normalcy for Grace's sake and the urgent necessity of building a legal case that might convince a judge to let her stay. He'd never felt so powerless in his life, not even during Martha's illness, when at least he'd known what enemy they were fighting. Bishop Kurtz proved invaluable in navigating the unfamiliar world of family law. Through connections in the broader Amish community, he located Sarah Whitman, an attorney in Lancaster who specialized in custody cases and had experience working with plain communities. Sarah was a slight woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. More importantly, she listened to their story without judgment and seemed genuinely moved by the bond between Amos and Grace. The challenge, Sarah explained during their first meeting in her modest office, is that Pennsylvania law strongly favors blood relatives in custody disputes, especially when the current guardian has no formal legal standing. Mr. Fisher's claim as Grace's uncle gives him significant advantages. Amos felt his heart sink, but Sarah continued. However, there are factors that work in your favor. Grace's age means the court will consider her preferences, though they won't be determinative. More importantly, any evidence of financial motivation on Mr. Fisher's part could seriously damage his case. Sarah had already begun investigating Caleb Fisher's background. What she discovered painted a troubling picture. Fisher owned a struggling farm in Holmes County that was heavily mortgaged. He defaulted on several loans and faced potential foreclosure within the year. Court records showed he'd been involved in disputes with other family members over inheritance matters. He's in serious financial trouble, Sarah said bluntly. The question is whether we can prove his interest in Grace is motivated by access to her inheritance rather than genuine concern for her welfare. The inheritance itself was substantial, nearly $200,000 from the sale of her parents' farm, held in trust until Grace reached 18. As her legal guardian, Caleb would have significant control over how that money was managed and spent for Grace's benefit. Can we prove he's after the money? Amos asked. We're working on it. I have investigators looking into his finances, his relationship with Grace's family, any evidence of his true motivations. Sarah leaned forward in her chair. But Amos, you need to understand, even if we can raise questions about his motives, the court's primary concern will be Grace's welfare. We need to demonstrate not just that Mr. Fisher might be unsuitable, but that staying with you is clearly in her best interests. This meant documenting everything about Grace's life with Amos. Sarah arranged for a social worker to visit the farm, to interview them both, to assess the home environment. She gathered medical records showing Grace's improved health and emotional stability. She collected testimony from community members about Grace's integration into their district, her progress in education, her obvious happiness and security. The most difficult part was preparing Grace herself for what lay ahead. Sarah explained that Grace would need to speak to the judge, to answer questions about her feelings and preferences. At 7 years old, Grace would have to articulate why she wanted to stay with Amos rather than go with her blood relative. What if I say the wrong thing? Grace asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance. What if the judge doesn't believe me when I say I want to stay here? You just tell the truth, Amos said, though his own fears echoed hers. Tell them how you feel, what this place means to you, why you want to stay. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently stroking her fabric doll. Papa Amos, what was it like when your parents died? Were you scared of being alone? Amos, had never spoken to Grace about his parents' deaths. She'd been dealing with enough loss of her own. But now, facing the possibility of losing her, he found himself sharing memories he'd buried for decades. "I was 16 when they died," he said. "Old enough to run the farm, but young enough to feel lost and frightened. The community helped, of course, but there were nights when I lay awake wondering if I was strong enough to carry on their legacy." "But you did carry it on. You took care of their farm, married Martha, built a good life." "Yes, but it took time. And it took finding the right person to share it with." He looked at Grace, this small girl who'd somehow become essential to his sense of purpose. "Sometimes families aren't just about blood, Grace. Sometimes they're about people who choose to love each other, who build something together that's stronger than what either could manage alone." Grace nodded seriously. Like us. As July 10th approached, the entire community rallied around Amos and Grace. Hannah Byler organized meals for them, ensuring they were well fed despite the stress. Other families offered to testify about Grace's integration into their district, her participation in church activities, her friendships with other children. The support was overwhelming and deeply moving, but it also highlighted what they stood to lose, not just each other, but Grace's place in the community that had become her home. On July 8th, Sarah called with disturbing news. Her investigators had uncovered more troubling information about Caleb Fisher. 3 years earlier, he'd been involved in a custody dispute over his own stepchildren following his second wife's death. The children had been removed from his care after allegations of neglect, though no criminal charges had been filed. "This is significant," Sarah said during an emergency meeting. "It establishes a pattern of using custody claims for financial gain rather than genuine care for children's welfare." But she paused, and Amos felt his stomach drop. Mr. Fisher's attorney has also been busy. They're arguing that Grace needs to be raised in a traditional family environment with proper parental figures, not by an elderly bachelor with no child-rearing experience. "I'm 58, not elderly," Amos protested. In custody cases, single male guardians face additional scrutiny. Sarah explained gently. "They're arguing that Grace needs a mother figure, that your arrangement is inappropriate for a growing girl." This hit Amos like a physical blow. Everything he'd provided for Grace, love, stability, education, a sense of belonging, could be dismissed because he was unmarried and male. The unfairness of it burned in his chest like acid dot the evening before the hearing. Amos found Grace in Martha's garden, sitting among the tomato plants they'd nurtured from seedlings. The vegetables were thriving, fat red tomatoes hanging heavy on the vines, bean poles loaded with climbing plants. The herbs section Martha had designed filling the air with the scent of basil and thyme. It was exactly what Martha had envisioned, brought to life by his and Grace's careful tending. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Grace said as he settled beside her on the grass. "Martha would be so proud of what we've grown." "She would," Amos agreed. "You've done something amazing here, Grace. You've brought her garden back to life." Grace was quiet for a moment, pulling at the grass between her fingers. "Papa Amos, what happens to the garden if I have to go with Uncle Caleb? What happens to all the things we've planted together?" The question broke his heart. "The garden will survive," he said, though he knew it wasn't true. Without Grace's enthusiasm and help, he'd probably let it revert to weeds again. Without her, everything on the farm would lose its meaning. "I don't want to go," Grace said quietly. "I know Uncle Caleb is family, but he doesn't feel like family. You feel like family. This place feels like home." "I know, sweetheart. I feel the same way." Grace turned to face him, her blue eyes serious in the gathering dusk. "Tomorrow, when I talk to the judge, I'm going to tell him that. I'm going to tell him that families aren't just about blood. They're about love and caring and building something together. I'm going to tell him that you saved my life when I thought it was over." Amos gathered her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "And I'm going to tell him that you saved mine." That night, neither of them slept well. Amos could hear Grace moving restlessly in her room, and twice he got up to check on her. She wasn't having nightmares. She was simply awake, staring at the ceiling, processing the magnitude of what tomorrow might bring. At dawn, they went through their normal routine one last time. Grace fed the chickens and gathered eggs while Amos milked the goats. They ate breakfast together at the kitchen table, though neither had much appetite. Grace wore her best dress, dark blue with a crisp white apron that Hannah had helped her iron. She carried her fabric doll, and at the last minute, she tucked Martha's garden journal into her small cloth bag. For luck, she explained when Amos questioned the choice, and to show the judge what we've built together. As they prepared to leave for the courthouse, Grace took one last look around the kitchen that had become her sanctuary. Her reading primers were stacked neatly on the counter, beside Martha's recipe box. Her small apron hung on its peg by the door. The morning light streamed through windows she'd helped wash just days before. "It will still be here when we get back," Amos said, though they both knew that might not be true. "I know," Grace said, with forced optimism. "And we'll make lunch together, and work in the garden, and read our lesson after supper." But as they climbed into the buggy for the ride to Lancaster, both understood they might be leaving their shared life behind forever. In a few hours, a judge would decide whether love and commitment could triumph over blood relations and legal technicalities, whether a lonely widower and an orphan child could continue to be each other's salvation, or whether the law would tear apart what their hearts had built together. The Lancaster County Courthouse was an imposing brick building that seemed designed to intimidate rather than comfort. Amos felt Grace's hand tighten in his as they climbed the stone steps, her small fingers cold despite the warm July morning. Sarah Whitman met them in the lobby, her professional calm a stark contrast to the chaos of emotions roiling through Amos's chest. "Remember," Sarah said quietly as they waited outside the courtroom, "answer the questions honestly and directly. Don't elaborate unless asked." And Grace, she knelt down to the child's level. "You're very brave for doing this. Just tell the judge what's in your heart." Grace nodded solemnly, clutching her fabric doll against her chest. She'd been unusually quiet during the buggy ride to town, and Amos could see the strain in her pale face. 7 years old was far too young to bear the weight of determining her own future, but circumstances had forced this impossible responsibility upon her small shoulders. When the courtroom doors opened, Amos's first glimpse of Caleb Fisher confirmed his worst fears. The man was large and imposing, with graying hair slicked back and clothes that spoke of trying to impress rather than simple functionality. He wore a suit that was slightly too tight and shoes that looked expensive but uncomfortable. His eyes, when they swept over Grace, held no warmth, only the calculating assessment of someone evaluating an asset. Beside Fisher sat his attorney, a sharp-faced man in an immaculate suit who shuffled through papers with practiced efficiency. Everything about their presentation screamed money and professional competence, designed to overwhelm the simple Amish farmer and his small-town lawyer. Judge Margaret Patterson was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind reading glasses. She'd been hearing family cases for over 20 years, and her reputation for fairness was well established in the legal community. As she reviewed the case files, her expression remained carefully neutral. "This hearing concerns the custody of Grace Miller, age 7, Judge Patterson began. Mr. Fisher, as the child's uncle and blood relative, seeks legal guardianship. Mr. Hostetter opposes. This petition based on his current care arrangement and the child's expressed preferences. Both parties understand this is a civil proceeding to determine what arrangement best serves the child's interests." Caleb Fisher's attorney spoke first, presenting what sounded like a perfectly reasonable case. Grace needed the stability of blood, family, the security of traditional parental figures, the cultural continuity that only relatives could provide. He painted Amos as well-meaning but inadequate, an aging bachelor with no child-rearing experience, no legal standing, and no ability to provide the maternal guidance a growing girl required. Mr. Fisher owns a prosperous farm in Ohio's Amish heartland, the lawyer continued. He can provide Grace with siblings through his own children, community connections, and the resources necessary for her proper upbringing. Mr. Hostetter, while undoubtedly caring, cannot offer these advantages. When it came time for cross-examination, Sarah's questions revealed the cracks in this polished presentation. Yes, Mr. Fisher's farm was heavily mortgaged. Yes, he'd had financial difficulties in recent years. And yes, he'd been involved in previous custody disputes that had ended unfavorably. Mr. Fisher, Sarah said, her voice calm but pointed, when did you first become aware that Grace was living with Mr. Hostetter? A few months ago, Fisher replied, his confidence wavering slightly. And? Yet Grace has been in Mr. Hostetter's care for over a year. Why the sudden interest in her welfare? I've been dealing with my own family troubles, including foreclosure proceedings on your farm. Fisher's jaw tightened. That's a temporary setback. I'm working to resolve those issues. Issues that would be considerably easier to resolve. With access to Grace's inheritance fund? Objection. Fisher's attorney interjected, but the damage was done. The question hung in the air like smoke, casting doubt on the uncle's true motivations. When Amos took the stand, Sarah guided him through his relationship with Grace, how she'd arrived traumatized and silent, how she'd gradually healed and thrived. In his care, he spoke about their daily routines, their evening lessons, the way Grace had brought joy and purpose back into his life. Mr. Hostetter, Sarah asked, what has caring for Grace meant to you personally? Amos looked across the courtroom at Grace, who sat in the front row with her doll in her lap and Martha's garden journal beside her. Grace saved my life, he said simply. I was just existing before she came, going through the motions of living, without any real purpose. She taught me how to hope again, how to plan for the future, how to love without fear. I would do anything to protect her, to give her the life she deserves. Fisher's attorney tried to rattle him during cross-examination, questioning his fitness as a single male guardian, his lack of formal education, his ability to provide proper supervision for a growing girl. But Amos answered each question with quiet dignity, his love for Grace evident in every word. The most powerful moment came when Sarah called Grace to testify. The small girl walked to the witness chair with her back straight and her chin up, though Amos could see her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. Grace, Judge Patterson said gently, I know this is scary, but I need to ask you some questions about where you want to live. Can you do that for me? Grace nodded, her voice clear when she spoke. Yes, ma'am. You've been living with Mr. Hostetter for over a year now. Can you tell me about that experience? Grace's face brightened as she began to speak about their life. Together learning to read, working in the garden, caring for the animals, the evening lessons by lamplight. Her love for Amos shone through every word, and her maturity impressed everyone in the courtroom. Grace, the judge continued, your Uncle Caleb says he can provide you with a family environment, with other children and a mother figure. Don't you think that might be good for you? Grace considered the question seriously before answering. Judge Patterson, I already have a family. Papa Amos is my family. We take care of each other, and we love each other, and we're building something beautiful together. She reached into her bag and pulled out Martha's garden journal. This belonged to his wife who died. We've been using it to grow the most beautiful garden. And Papa Amos says that families aren't just about blood. They're about people who choose to love each other and build something that's stronger than what either could do alone. The courtroom was completely silent as Grace's words hung in the air. Even Fisher's attorney seemed momentarily speechless in the face of such eloquent testimony. From a 7-year-old child. Judge Patterson leaned forward in her chair, her attention completely focused on the small girl who had just delivered one of the most moving testimonies she'd heard in decades of family court proceedings. "Grace," the judge said gently, "that's a very wise way to think about family. But I need to ask you about your Uncle Caleb. He's your father's brother, your blood relative. Don't you think you should get to know him better?" Grace turned to look at Caleb Fisher for the first time since entering the courtroom. Her gaze was steady and assessing, far too mature for a 7-year-old. When she turned back to the judge, her voice was quiet but firm. "I met Uncle Caleb when I was little at my grandpa's funeral. He made my papa sad, and my mama said he was only interested in what Grandpa left behind, not in saying goodbye." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I know he's blood family, but he feels like a stranger. Papa Amos feels like home." Fisher's attorney made one last attempt to salvage their case. "Your Honor, with respect to the child's feelings, she's simply too young to understand the complexities of what's best for her future. Mr. Fisher can provide proper schooling, appropriate gender role models, and financial security that is struggling. Farmer cannot match." Sarah stood to object. "Your Honor, Mr. Hostetter is hardly struggling. His farm is debt-free, his income is stable, and Grace's educational progress under his tutelage has been remarkable. As for gender role models, the entire Amish community provides support and guidance. Grace has formed close relationships with several women in the district, including Mrs. Hannah Byler, who's been particularly helpful." Judge Patterson nodded, making notes in her file. "I'd like to review some additional evidence before making my decision." She examined the social worker's report, character references from community members, and Grace's educational assessments. The documentation painted a clear picture of a child who was thriving under Amos's care. "Mr. Fisher," the judge said, turning to face Caleb directly, "I'm troubled by some inconsistencies in your testimony. You claim to have only recently learned of Grace's living situation, yet court records show you were involved in settling her parents' estate over a year ago. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Fisher shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I've been dealing with my own family issues, as I mentioned. My farm has faced some challenges that have resulted in pending foreclosure proceedings. That's a temporary situation." Judge Patterson's voice sharpened. "Mr. Fisher, this court has a responsibility to ensure that any custody arrangement serves the child's best interests, not the guardian's financial needs. Your recent interest in Grace's welfare, coinciding with your own economic difficulties, and her substantial inheritance, raises serious questions about your motivations." Fisher's composure finally cracked. "Look, the girl belongs with family, real family. Not some old man who—" "That's enough," Judge Patterson said firmly. "Mr. Fisher, your attitude toward both Grace and Mr. Hostetter is exactly the kind of concern this court must consider." The judge turned back to Grace, who had been watching the proceedings with wide, serious eyes. "Grace, I have one more question for you. If you could stay with Mr. Hostetter, what would you want your life to look like?" Grace's face lit up with the first genuine smile she'd shown all day. "I want to finish learning to read all the books in Papa Amos's house. I want to help him with the harvest from our garden. I want to keep learning to work with wood in his workshop. He's teaching me to make a hope chest like he made for Martha. And I want to help take care of the animals, especially Thunder the goat, who only lets me brush him now." She paused, then added quietly, "And I want to keep being Papa Amos's daughter, because that's what I am now." Judge Patterson spent several minutes reviewing her notes while the courtroom waited in tense silence. Finally, she looked up, her decision clear in her expression. This case presents a conflict between legal presumptions and demonstrated realities, she began. Pennsylvania law generally favors placement with blood relatives, and Mr. Fisher's claim as Grace's uncle cannot be dismissed lightly. However, the evidence presented today raises serious questions about Mr. Fisher's motivations and his ability to provide appropriate care. Amos felt his heart hammering against his ribs as the judge continued. The court finds that Grace Miller has formed a profound and beneficial attachment to Mr. Hostetter, who has provided exceptional care during a critical period in her development. Her educational progress, emotional stability, and obvious happiness in his care demonstrate that this arrangement serves her best interests. Grace reached across the courtroom railing to grab Amos's hand, her face glowing with hope. Furthermore, Judge Patterson continued, Mr. Fisher's financial difficulties and his delayed interest in Grace's welfare suggest that his custody petition may be motivated by access to her inheritance rather than genuine concern for her well-being. Caleb. Fisher half rose from his chair, his face red with anger. This is ridiculous. Mr. Fisher, you will remain seated, the judge said sternly. The court hereby grants legal custody of Grace Miller to Amos Hostetter, with full adoption proceedings to be initiated immediately. Mr. Fisher's petition is denied. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration from the Amish community members who had come to support them. Grace burst into tears of relief and joy, and Amos found himself crying 2 tears of gratitude and overwhelming relief. Sarah Whitman leaned over to shake his hand. Congratulations, Amos. Grace is officially yours now. As Caleb Fisher stormed out of the courtroom with his attorney, Grace climbed over the railing and threw herself into Amos's arms. I get to stay, she whispered against his neck. I get to stay with you forever. Forever, Amos promised, holding her tight. You're my daughter now, Grace Hostetter. Nothing will ever change that. Judge Patterson smiled as she watched the reunion, then called them forward to complete the necessary paperwork. Grace would need a new birth certificate, new legal documents reflecting her adoption. But most importantly, she would never again have to worry about being taken away from the only real home she'd ever known. As they left the courthouse together, Grace's hand firmly clasped in his, Amos felt a peace he hadn't experienced since Martha's death. His family was whole again, different than before, built from love rather than blood, but no less real for being chosen rather than inherited. 6 months later, on a crisp December morning, Amos stood in his kitchen watching his daughter help Hannah Byler prepare their wedding feast. Grace moved between the 2 adults with easy familiarity, her small hands competent as she rolled out pie crust under Hannah's patient guidance. The scene was so domestic, so perfectly right, that Amos had to pause in his coffee drinking to fully appreciate it. Papa Amos, Grace called, looking up from her work with flour dusting her cheek. Hannah says I can be the one to carry the rings during the ceremony. Is that all right with you? I can't think of anyone I'd rather have do it, Amos replied, earning a brilliant smile from his daughter. Grace had been the one to suggest the marriage in the first place, pointing out with her characteristic directness that Hannah made them both happy and that their family could always use more love. Hannah caught his eye over Grace's head and smiled, same warm, understanding expression that had drawn him to her during those tentative summer conversations. Their courtship had been slow and careful, with Grace as both chaperone and enthusiastic matchmaker. Hannah understood that she wasn't replacing Martha, but rather adding her own unique love to a family that had room to grow. The transformation in their lives over the past year had been remarkable. What began as a temporary arrangement between a grieving widower and an orphaned child had evolved into something far more precious, a family bound not by blood but by choice, commitment, and deep affection. The legal adoption had made it official, but their hearts had known the truth long before any judge confirmed it. Grace had flourished in ways that amazed everyone who knew her. The frightened, silent child who'd arrived 18 months ago had become a confident young girl with opinions, dreams, and the secure knowledge that she was loved unconditionally. Her reading had progressed to the point where she devoured books with voracious appetite, and her mathematical skills impressed the community's most traditional members. More importantly, the nightmares had stopped entirely, replaced by peaceful sleep and dreams of the future. The wedding ceremony took place in the same meeting house where Amos had worshipped for nearly 60 years. Standing before Bishop Kurtz, with Hannah at his side and Grace beaming in the front row, he felt the profound rightness of new beginnings built on strong foundations. Grace had been right. Love didn't run out when you shared it. Instead, it multiplied and deepened, creating connections that strengthened everyone involved. After the ceremony, as the community gathered for the traditional feast, Amos found himself watching Grace interact with her expanding family. Hannah's teenage son, Mark, had initially been uncertain about acquiring an 8-year-old stepsister, but Grace's quiet wisdom and genuine interest in his carpentry projects had won him over completely. She now had an older brother who taught her advanced woodworking techniques and protected her with fierce determination. The feast tables groaned under the weight of traditional dishes: roasted chicken and beef, mountains of mashed potatoes, green beans cooked with bacon, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and pies of every description. But at the center of the main table sat a special addition: apple butter made from Martha's recipe, prepared by Grace and Amos using apples from the restored orchard. "It tastes just like Martha used to make," elderly Mrs. Yoder commented, spreading the deep brown preserve on a piece of fresh bread. "Grace, you have your grandmother's gift for cooking." The casual reference to Martha as Grace's grandmother sent a warm glow through Amos's chest. The community had fully embraced Grace as his daughter, as Martha's spiritual heir in the kitchen, as a natural part of their extended family. She belonged here completely now, her legal adoption having settled any remaining questions about her place in their world. During a quiet moment in the celebration, Grace pulled Amos aside to the workshop they'd continued to share. Her latest project, a hope chest carved with roses in imitation of the one he'd made for Martha, sat nearly finished on the workbench. The craftsmanship was remarkable for someone so young, showing both natural talent and the patience that came from careful instruction. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into her apron pocket. She pulled out a small wooden box, perfectly proportioned and beautifully finished. "I made it for your wedding present, to keep special things in." Amos accepted the box with reverence, running his fingers over the smooth wood and examining the careful joinery. Grace's woodworking skills had progressed remarkably over the past year, but this piece showed a level of craftsmanship that impressed even him. "It's beautiful, Grace. What inspired you to make it?" "Remember when I first came here, and I was scared my doll would get lost if I didn't hold her all the time? I thought maybe you might have special things that needed a safe place too." Amos opened the box to find it wasn't empty. Inside lay a photograph, the only one he owned of Martha, taken on their wedding day 43 years ago. Beside it was one of Grace's first attempts at writing, a note that read, "Papa Amos is the best teacher and the kindest papa in the world." There was also a pressed flower from Martha's restored garden, and a small wooden heart that Grace had carved during her earliest lessons. "Grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "how did you?" "I asked Hannah to help me find the picture. In your room. I thought maybe it was time for Martha to be part of our family celebrations instead of hidden away. And I wanted you to know that I'll never forget who taught me to read and write and think about important things." As they stood together in the workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that had become their shared language, Amos marveled at the transformation they'd both undergone. Grace had arrived as a traumatized orphan afraid to hope for stability, and had become a confident young girl secure in her place in the world. He had been a bitter widower convinced his capacity for love had died with Martha, and had discovered that the heart could expand to hold new relationships without diminishing old ones. The garden that had brought them together continued to be a source of joy and connection. Under Grace's enthusiastic care, it had produced an abundant harvest that fed not only their own family, but provided surplus for elderly neighbors and community members in need. Grace had learned to can vegetables using Martha's methods, to save seeds for the following year, and to plan crop rotations that would maintain soil health. The garden had become her passion as much as his, a living symbol of their shared commitment to nurturing growth and abundance. "You know what I think?" Grace said, carefully replacing the box's contents and closing the lid. "I think this is what Martha wanted when she told you to keep living. Not just to go through the motions, but to really live to love people and teach them things and build a family that makes the world a little bit better." The wisdom in her words, wisdom earned through loss and rebuilt through love, took Amos's breath away. At 8 years old, Grace understood truths about life and resilience that many adults never grasp. She had taken the pain of losing her parents and transformed it into compassion for others who suffered. She had taken the fear of abandonment and turned it into determination to create lasting connections. As they rejoined the wedding celebration, Amos felt the deep satisfaction of promises kept and dreams fulfilled. Martha's garden bloomed under Grace's care. Her recipes lived on in Grace's capable hands, and her legacy of love had expanded to encompass new relationships and possibilities. Grace had learned to read and write and think critically about the world around her. She had a brother who adored her, a stepmother who treasured her, and a father who would protect and nurture her for the rest of his life. The evening wound down with community, members sharing stories and offering blessings for the new family. Grace moved among the guests with natural grace, thanking them for coming, accepting congratulations on her new brother and stepmother, and demonstrating the social confidence that had emerged from feeling truly secure in her place in the world. As the last guest departed, and the three of them, Amos, Hannah, and Grace, cleaned up the remnants of their celebration, Grace looked around the kitchen that had become the heart of their blended family. The same room where she'd first discovered Martha's recipe cards, where she'd learned to read by lamplight, where she'd found safety and love when she'd thought both were lost forever. "You know what, Papa Amos?" she said, hanging up her apron beside Hannah's and his own. "I think we're really good at being a family." "Yes," Amos agreed, pulling both his wife and daughter into a gentle embrace. "I think we're very good at it indeed." Outside, snow began to fall on the Hostetter farm, blanketing the dormant garden that would bloom again come spring, covering the peaceful barnyard where Grace's chickens roosted safely for the night. Inside, the kitchen glowed with lamplight and lingered with the warmth of a family that had chosen each other, built something beautiful from the fragments of loss, and discovered that love like Martha's garden could bloom again when tended with patience, hope, and unwavering care. Grace picked up her fabric doll from where it sat on the windowsill, the same doll she'd clutched desperately during those first fearful days. Now it was simply a cherished reminder of her journey, no longer a lifeline, but a symbol of how far she'd traveled from that frightened orphan to this confident, beloved daughter. "Tomorrow," she announced as they prepared for bed, "I want to start planning next year's garden. Hannah has some ideas about herbs, and Mark thinks we should try growing pumpkins for the autumn harvest." Amos smiled, recognizing in her words the same forward-looking optimism that had once characterized Martha's approach to life. Grace had learned not just to survive loss, but to transform it into hope, to take broken pieces and build something stronger than what had come before. As he tucked his daughter into bed, now in the larger room that Hannah had helped her decorate, with quilts and bookshelves and space for all her growing interests. Grace looked up at him with those serious blue eyes that had first captured his attention nearly 2 years ago. "Papa Amos, do you think Mama and Papa would be happy about how everything turned out?" I think they'd be amazed by the remarkable, young woman you're becoming, Amos said, kissing her forehead. And I think they'd be grateful that you found a place where you can grow and thrive and become everything they dreamed you could be. Grace nodded, satisfied with this answer. Good night, Papa. Good night, Hannah. Good night, Martha, she added softly, acknowledging the presence that had blessed their family from the beginning. As Amos and Hannah settled into their own room, the same room he'd shared with Martha, but now made new with shared love and shared purpose, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them all together. A grieving widower, a traumatized orphan, and a lonely widow had found each other and created something greater than the sum of their individual parts. The last thing Amos saw before sleep claimed him was Martha's hope chest in the corner of the room, soon to be joined by the one Grace was crafting with her own hands. Past and future, loss and hope, old love and new love, all woven together in the quiet miracle of a family that had chosen to heal together, to grow together, to build a legacy of love that would endure for generations to come.